All right, very good. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I really appreciate you being here. We're going to have some interesting conversation. This is set up as a webinar, and you will want to enter your questions in Q&A. We have that enabled as the chat. So when I mention chat, just use the Q&A. You know that's what I'm talking about there. October 31st, happy All Saints Day. I believe that's the name of it in the religious world, in the Catholic world. And happy Halloween for the rest of you heathens out there, you pagans. We appreciate you. I know some of you are dressed up. This is done as a webinar, so we don't have cameras on intentionally because I knew somebody would be acting silly. And invariably, there'd be somebody showing up with a dog barking in the background. So we're going to do it as a webinar. This is recorded. We are going to post it on the Benchmark YouTube channel later this afternoon. And that address for the Benchmark YouTube channel is at Benchmark Realty LLC on YouTube. So let's get started. Today, we are doing things a little bit differently. We're going to talk about forms. We have been talking about this internally, but now we're kind of exposing it to you for the first time. The benchmark buyer rep agreement, we've made some minor revisions to it. We're going to go through that. The benchmark listing agreement, we made some minor revisions. We're going to go through that. Then we're going to introduce the new benchmark purchase and sale agreement, and then also the end of your process if you decide to not renew your association membership. We have a place for you. That's our main thing, is transparency and service to the agent and service to the consumer. Those are our North Stars, period. Nothing else to us really matters. Some guidelines for today. Presenters, myself, Phillip Cantrell. I'm the founder of Benchmark Realty. It's Scott Rowland, who's the president of Benchmark Realty. And then David Lee, who you can see on screen there, is the director of compliance. He is the fellow behind the scenes that makes sure that everything gets answered correctly and all the paperwork is done correctly. And then, of course, Griffin Dunham, our attorney with Momentum Title. So let me just kind of give all the listeners here a background on these four people. I have been in real estate since 2001, actually since Y2K, year 2000 is when I got into real estate. I've been licensed since 2002. Scott Rowland has been licensed since 2002. David Lee's been licensed since 2003. Griffin Dunham is not licensed, but he's a really smart guy. Collectively, the three brokers on here have represented personally more than 3,000 buyers and sellers in transactions ourselves. Our company, Benchmark Realty, will do north of 10,000 transactions this year and about $5 billion of the real estate sold. And then Griffin Dunham, our attorney, he will not want to talk about this, but he has argued and won cases before the U.S. Supreme Court before. So this is your working group of the people who created these forms. We are serious business people and we know what we're doing. So we have tried to do this in a manner that simplifies the entire process. So anyway, next bullet point, we will not discuss or compare any sort of conversation about the TNR forms. That is irrelevant for the sake of our discussion today. So we will not answer any of those questions if you do put them in the chat. Understanding that the use of the new benchmark purchase and sale agreement is optional for realtors, for those who remain association members. It is mandatory for those who choose to be non-realtors as of January 1st, 2026. We covered this in the previous Fridays with Phillip that is hanging out there on a YouTube channel. You can go watch that video if you're curious about it. We will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so put your questions into the chat Q&A, as I just mentioned earlier, and we'll answer them at the end. I would advise you to listen carefully and take notes. Don't listen with an ear of, this is what I thought he said. Write it down. I am going to be very careful in what I say here because I know others are watching, and I know we want to make sure we say things exactly the right way. And of course, anytime something's being recorded, we have to be careful. So we will answer as many questions as we can during the presentation if they are important. One thing I would encourage you to do is to not catastrophize. Let's just walk through this together as a simplified explanation. We'll talk about questions and answers, and then we'll get through it in about an hour, a little over an hour and a half, maybe. We'll see. So first of all, we had already introduced the benchmark buyer representation and listing agreement. These obviously are internal forms. So if you're an external agent watching this presentation, this really doesn't concern you because it is an internal form. But we introduced those back in May and made them mandatory starting June 1 of 2025. And we actually have enforced this with multiple emails to let benchmarkians know they must use these documents. They are not optional. In fact, we actually invoke a fine for repeat offenders after a certain period of time. We believe that these forms follow the letter of the settlement agreement, and they indicate extreme transparency, and we'll talk about those and you'll see it. But if you are a Benchmark affiliate, you are required to use the Benchmark buyer rep and the Benchmark listing agreement. Using the TAR agreement is not optional. Just want to reemphasize that. So what did we do with the Benchmark buyer rep agreement? We made some minor revisions. We wanted to make sure that our definitions were clear, that we were even more compliant with the 2025, 2024 settlement agreements. And the focus here on all of the things that we do is on transparency for the consumer and simplifying how the transaction works. And more important than anything, we listen to your feedback. We listened to what you were saying, what you were telling us, where the difficult portions were. And of course, you have to kind of start somewhere and then polish it as we go. So that's what we've done with both the buyer rep and the listing agreement. So let's get into the changes of the buyer rep agreement specifically. This is what it looks like. And as you can see, the first thing that you will notice, and I'm going to do this as I walk through this, I'm going to first show you the full page, and then I'm going to break it down to where it is larger so you can see it on a smaller screen if you have it. And I'm just kind of getting wigged out by my camera moving around there. I gotta figure out what that is, but that's okay. So you can see the first thing you'll notice is that we added line numbers. This is something that a lot of people were talking to us about that we were finding in compliance. That was a repeated problem. Then we wanted to clarify. So let's just walk through it. The first agreement, the first paragraph up there did not change. The broker firm did not change. The address firm line, the buyer line didn't change. The property lines, those paragraphs did not change. And we have the ability to write in there other geographic area, be specific. And specificity always is the better way to do it. We did change this part at the bottom, the length of the agreement. Subject to section 13, I think we actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, but I think we actually had a typo in there. Is that right?
We had it referring to a different section, so yes.
Yeah, but that was the only thing that we changed there, right?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So that portion that you see right there, and I'm going to put my highlighter pen out here just so you can, laser pointer, just so you can see that. Subject to section 13, that was the only thing that we changed in that area, as well as the line numbers that we added over here on the left. Moving on to the bottom half of that page, all we added was a form number down here at the bottom, a title, a copyright, a revision date, and then we also went from 4 pages down to 3 pages. So we simplified it for you. We had some extra space in the other form, and we simplified that. So this is only a 3-page form now. So we're making it easier for you. Our numbering system on these documents, we will give you a complete list of those. And just pausing for a moment and talking about that, we have a complete forms library that we will begin exposing you to over the next 60 to 90 days. And then if you are a non-realtor, they will be available in .loop or on Benchmark Dash starting January 1. But we'll begin exposing you to it. Tell us what, do you have a junket in the offices planned, David? Are you going around classes, I believe?
Yes, we are. It'll be November and December.
Okay. Trying to adjust my camera here. Sorry about that, y'all. That's very unprofessional, but it is what it is. So November, December, we'll have these in classes. We'll have handouts. We'll walk through each form. We'll walk through the purchase sale agreement. We'll walk through all the list of the library that we have. And so don't catastrophize on any of this and think that you have to know it today. You've got plenty of time here to review these forms and to decide if, in fact, you want to use them. So moving on to the next page, we didn't change anything. And we're talking about the broker fee up there at the top. And then the collecting the broker fee from the seller. We've discussed this pretty well sufficiently, I believe. Have there been any questions that came up, David or Scott, in in those conversations over the last several months that we need to talk about here? Is there confusion here? I don't believe there is, but if there is, y'all let me know.
I think we're pretty clear. We're not having any issues from compliance on this.
Okay, very good. Very good. Everybody knows how they're going to get paid and how to present them and have the conversation. And keep in mind, this has got to be signed before they show the house, right? This has got to predate the contract, the offer. That's part of the settlement agreement. That's not optional. That's not a benchmark rule. That is an industry-wide rule now that you must have this executed on a date that is prior to the contract, to the offer. So you want to make sure that you have that in place. Going back to the full page, and then the bottom of that page, we didn't change anything there. There's a carryover clause, there's a fair housing clause, there's additional video recording warning, additional terms. Anything that's extra would go into that blank, just like it has in the past. And then it talks about other buyers, just letting the buyer know that we may be representing other buyers in purchasing the property as a buyer, just as a disclosure. The last page now, all we have done is added another signature for a benchmark agent down there. It is identical to the one above it on line 120. We've added the one at 126. There's Scott. Hello, Scott. Say something, man. But it's,
Sorry for the issues.
yeah.
Still excited for the call. Still glad everybody's on here and excited to have options for our industry moving forward.
Some days are like that, brother. Some days are like that. So that's the buyer rep agreement. We really didn't change much, as you can see. We just made some clarification, added some line numbers, put a form number at the bottom of it. It's now known as Form 301 for us, and pretty straightforward stuff. Now moving on to the listing agreement. We again, we streamlined it a little bit, organized it a little bit better, clarified the commission. And again, our focus is 100% on transparency in the transaction. There was a clause here that we'll talk about here in just a second, where agents were getting, or affiliates were getting confused on how the commission works. And I want to remind everybody, starting off in the very beginning, is that our policy is we do not offer guaranteed shared compensation. If you're an outside agent and you're bringing an offer on a benchmark listing, when you ask what is the seller offering, our response is going to be put it in the offer. Total transparency, let the two parties work it out between the buyer and the seller. It's not our responsibility as a brokerage to determine what every other agent makes. It's what the other agent decides they can earn and negotiate. And that's been our policy for, gosh, what, guys, a year now? And we had to actually issue it in writing so that others would know and understand it, and our agents would have a piece of paper to wave at them. And we've done that. That, again, is covered in a previous video. So if you have a question on that, then you can go back to those previous videos that are hanging out there on our YouTube channel, which is at Benchmark Realty LLC on YouTube. And you could find those Fridays with Phillip, where we had those discussions about shared compensation. Anyway, again, you'll notice, going to blow this up again, and you'll notice the first thing is that we have added line numbers, just like we did before. The first paragraph didn't change. The listing broker didn't change. The designated agent didn't change. We did modify some spacing in this area, but none of the copy was modified until we get down here to paragraph 7. And we had a confusion where it would get signed one day by the wife and get signed the next day by the husband, and they didn't know exactly what day the listing started. So we've tried to clarify this. And by changing the verbiage there, and that verbiage reads, the length of the agreement. So this agreement shall begin on the date last executed by the seller and the broker, that'd be you, the agent, and will automatically end on blank date at 11:59 p.m. in the property's time zone, or upon closing or termination, so on and so forth. And this next paragraph is pretty important right here, okay? This next sentence, rather. If marketing, showing, or MLS of the property, MLS entry of the property is to commence at a date other than the execution of this agreement, indicate those specifics in section 24, additional terms and conditions. Okay, so I want to be clear on that. You got a date when the listing starts, and you got a date when the marketing starts. And that date when the marketing starts, if it's different than this date you see on the screen, then that needs to be identified in section 24. And if it's not, our compliance people are going to come back to you and say, what the heck, y'all? Right? That's the terminology you use in that department, David. What the heck? Yeah.
That's exactly what we use.
It's a scientific methodology that we have there. So that's an important change. You need to keep that in mind there. Going back to going to the bottom of that page, the only thing that we added was the form number. It's now form 101. Has a revision date, the copyright date, and then page 1 of 5. This document remains 5 pages just as it was before, so nothing was changed there. Next page, pretty straightforward. We're talking about the listing broker salary. Let me go back one just a minute, okay? So let's go back to this bottom here. This has been the beginning of confusion. The listing broker compensation. A broker will earn compensation, hereinafter referred to as listing broker compensation, when a sale of property has been completed, regardless of who has found the buyer. Listing broker compensation shall be paid by seller in U.S. funds at the time of and condition of sale completion. This agreement shall serve as escrow instructions. Listing broker compensation is check 1, exactly how it works. Then we move to unrepresented buyer. And this one we changed rather dramatically because this was a lot of confusion. Unrepresented buyer. If buyer is not represented by a broker, hereinafter referred to as buyer's broker, then listing broker assumes additional liability and paperwork responsibilities. In this scenario, listing broker does not represent buyer, but will facilitate the completion of necessary forms and ensure fair treatment of all parties. In this situation, the listing broker compensation shall be a total compensation for all services rendered in this transaction of exactly blank or blank of the gross purchase price as reflected in the final settlement statement. Okay? So let's talk about that collectively for a second. This is those 2 paragraphs combined. There's been a lot of confusion here, which none of us on this side of the table really understand why, other than the fact that you learned that you got paid for X. If the buyer was not represented, you got paid for X, all right? That's basically what we're doing, but it's not additional, it's separate. So you can see them together there and understand that they are not collective, they are separate. And I wanted to clarify that. David, Scott, do you have anything you want to speak to on that?
The largest thing that we need to keep in mind is your blanks down in 57 and 58 should always be at least or more than what you have in 47 through 50.
Been a lot of confusion on that. I don't really understand it, but we clarified here by saying in boldface, all caps, total compensation for this transaction, if an unrepresented buyer shows up, is X. Okay? Pretty straightforward stuff. You have anything on that, Scott?
No, I think this change clears it up, and both agents and compliant should be happy.
Okay. That's good. Let me just check something right here fast on the okay, for some reason I can't see the questions. I was going to see if there were questions I needed to answer because somebody was raising their hand, but Katie,
There's one right here, Phillip.
Okay.
There's one, line 57 can be more if we're doing all of the paperwork.
Yeah.
Yes. As long as it's equal or greater, then you're good. And if you remember that, you can't mess this up.
There you go.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry.
questions in the Q&A.
Okay. Just remember that down here, this number here must be equal or greater than this number up here. That's all you got to know. All right. It's not additional. These are separate paragraphs. These are separate items. This up here says I'm going to get paid to listing the property. This down here says I'm going to get paid a total compensation if an unrepresented buyer shows up. It's really, we try to make it as simple and straightforward as possible. Don't overcomplicate it. Read the words, understand the words. It's pretty straightforward stuff. Okay. Moving on to the other part of that page, that'd be page 2, seller concessions. We did not change that part. Again, all we did in this area was modify the spacing a little bit. And the organization didn't change at all. So it's really straightforward stuff. Page 3, again, broker services. It details out. This was very spacey in the original one, so the format changed considerably, but the copy, the type, the font did not change at all. Seller commitment, and then of course we added the page number, the line numbers you see there on the left. And then fixtures included or excluded. We didn't change this, but I do want to call it out that you need to pay attention to what this says. And let me just give you some universal advice here, if I may. And I think that compliance will encourage this, and of course Scott will encourage it, and every attorney on the face of this planet will encourage it. Read the form. Read every line, every sentence of the form, understand it. Ask questions if you don't understand it before you go using it. Okay? This is exactly how this works. You are performing a legal function here. You're not just playing fill in the blanks in grade school, right? So you need to read the form and understand the form. We have a full compliance department. We have a principal broker staff that has experience that defies explanation. It's amazing the experience of our principal brokers, and every one of them is qualified to answer questions, but you must read the document to understand what questions to ask and understand what questions may be asked of you by your client. That is your fiduciary responsibility. I can't emphasize that enough. Make sure you read all that, make sure you understand. And then at the bottom, we added another signature line for another benchmark agent, because sometimes we have lots of agents that will co-list properties together, particularly if it's a team, and we'll want to get the team leader signature on there if he's getting paid. So that was the added content. That was the basis of it. Do we want to pause and answer any questions there?
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay. So we have a question about E&O. E&O does not care what form you use, okay? So that should be answered there. Line 57 can be more if we're doing all the paperwork. We answered that one. It should be at least the same as or more, but it should never be less than line 47, okay? So there's that. Gosh, we got a principal broker on here asking questions. I'm not even going to acknowledge that. We'll talk to him after a while. Walter, what is you give the seller a discount for doing both? We don't care what you charge. We do not care what you charge. We're not going to discuss commission rates here. So charge whatever you want to charge. Our fees remain the same regardless of what you charge, whether you charge $100,000 commission or whether you charge $0 commission. Our fees are the same. You are 100% in charge of that. What if you're receiving other from line 51? So, okay, so let's go back to line 51 if I can. See exactly what we're talking about here. Other. Okay, so this is, let me get to it's blown up real well here. Okay, so he's talking about the listing broker compensation. What if you're receiving other? Okay, so you write other in there. And then you want to, so I assume the question has to do with unrepresented buyer. What do you put if you're receiving other for listing? You need to name a number. You need to name a number. You need to put either a dollar amount in there or a percentage of the gross sales price for doing that extra work. So hopefully that answers your question. That was a weird one there. This avoids having to write this in special stipulations. Yes, it does. So it's pretty straightforward. Okay. We use RF 601 for any listing amendments. We have, Deborah, we have a complete library of forms that we have not introduced yet. We will have our own amendments. We will have our own documents. As I said at the beginning of this conversation, if you remain a realtor, you have access to all of the TNR forms. You will remain have access to that. You can either use their forms or our forms. We don't care. We accept either one if you are a realtor. If you're a non-realtor, you have no choice but to use our forms because TNR forms are copyrighted. So that should make sense. And if you are a realtor, to answer your question directly, you can use either their listing amendment or our listing amendment, either one. So in the listing agreement, do we add the buyer broker compensation as well as sellers agreeing to pay? Rennie, we do not share compensation. Please refer back to our shared compensation conversation. That is a conversation you need to have. Again, review the videos that we have on YouTube. And if you have a question on that, please call your broker and have a conversation, have a meeting so that you fully understand exactly how that works. Okay. Is there a benchmark listing amendment? Yes. As I said, again, I will say we have a complete library of forms that should provide everything that you need that we will be introducing over the next 60 days. Line 55 of listing broker compensation, the word facilitate may be confusing. It should be clear that as a listing agent, you will represent the seller and the buyer is unrepresented. And that's exactly what the form says, Jennifer. Thank you. Has there been an amendment created to change these two forms? We have an amendment form again. So I'm just gonna kind of stop reading these and skip over them right fast. All right. Bear with me just a second. I want to read through these before I read them out loud. Basically, okay. Jennifer Hayden, the question is correct. It has to be at least, so this number 57 or 58 must be the same or more than 47, 48, or 49. Okay. And the reason I didn't repeat the question was because she had named some percentages in there, and we're not going to discuss percentages on a recording. Sorry. Regarding what and where for the buyer search, regarding the what and where for the buyer search and the buyer rep agreement, can you speak on the ramifications and offer insight on stating more vagueness versus drill down specificity, especially in the case a buyer hasn't truly figured out the what and the where? Okay, so going back to the buyer rep agreement, he's talking about, I don't want to go too far back, but he's basically asking about this section right here in the buyer rep agreement on the 16 and the 18. And he's asking, is there a problem if that's too vague? We have seen all sorts of things there. My suggestion is that if you have any enforceability hopes later, that you want to be as specific as possible. And Griffin, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think invariably you can modify that as you go through it, but you need to have something in there to have a target to hit, if that makes sense. Do you agree with that, Griffin? Yep. He's shaking his head yes, and give me a thumbs up. Let's see. Going to be part of our security. Okay, so somebody's asking an association question, and we will answer that directly. Please talk to your broker on that as to what association we belong to and what we don't belong to. By the way, let me clarify this, and there's a big rumor going around. Well, that question came up earlier. Benchmark Realty, as an organization, as an entity, is not withdrawing from the Association of Realtors. There are some brokers in this town that have been spreading that rumor, and it needs to stop because it's completely false. We are not withdrawing from the Association of Realtors. We will modify how we belong. We will probably curtail some local association memberships, but we will remain a member of TAR and remain a member of NAR because their rules say that you can't belong unless we belong. So going back to my original conversation, I want you to understand this clearly. Our purpose, our focus, our whole design here at Benchmark is to provide a platform for you, the agent, to bolt your business on. We are not going to make judgments on whether you're right, whether you're wrong, whether you're bad, or whether you're good. We don't care on that aspect of it. Well, we do care if you're bad, but we'll kick you out on that one. But the point is that we are going to still remain members of the National Association of Realtors as long as it exists, the Tennessee Association of Realtors as long as it exists, and local associations. We just don't know exactly which ones. Check with your principal broker to see which one they belong to. That would be the best guidance I can offer on that. The other side of it is that we have, we'll talk about this later on in this presentation, how we have structured. We basically restructured the format to accommodate those who do not wish to be realtors. We believe that is our duty and our responsibility to create and make sure that platform is as out of your way, as benign, as non-interfering as humanly possible. And that's the whole focus of this. We're not anti anything. We are pro choice. We are pro agent. We are pro consumer, period. The rest of it is noise and does not matter. So I want to make sure that everybody understands that clearly. And you have this on the recording. You can go back and listen to it over and over again. We don't care which association you belong to. Okay, there we go. Said it. Now I'll quit preaching, right? We keep asking about the listing amendment. We've got more documents coming. We are only covering 3 documents today. We're covering the buyer rep agreement. We're covering the listing agreement. We're covering the new purchase and sale agreement. Those are the only 3 we're covering today, but we have a complete library of forms coming. So we have those, and that's like the 4th time we've had that. Can we use these forms prior to January 1? Would they be available? The answer is no. We will release them January 1. Are the new versions on Transaction Desk? I'm not seeing them. These are non-realtor forms. They will not be on Transaction Desk. They will be on Dotloop and on our Dash. Transaction Desk is owned, the transaction account that you have is controlled by the Tennessee Association of Realtors. We do not control it. We do not have anything to do with it. We're not going to put these forms in it. Okay. Let's go on. Okay, if I, so here's a pertinent question, and I think I've already explained this, but I want to reiterate it again. If I choose to remain a member of the associations, which benchmark forms am I required to use? You are not required. You can use either one if you're a realtor. Only if you are a non-realtor can you not use the TAR forms. Hopefully that makes sense, Mark. The new listing agreement, and so when is the new listing agreement available? It was available June 1, Daniel. This version, I know what you're saying. I'm just playing with you. This version will be uploaded this week. They will not be available in Dash or Dotloop today. We're not going to release the full library of forms until the end of the year. All right. Okay, so let's move on. I'm getting a lot of same questions from the same people. So let's move on then. Get through the moving on to the presentation. We have the right to sell listing agreement and the chain may just, hopefully everybody's clear on the compensation section portion. By the way, if y'all have put a question out there that I've already answered, please go to Q&A and delete your questions so we don't repeat ourselves. That would be very helpful for those who are watching from the sidelines. Okay, so now we get to the big rock. You ready for this? I'm gonna let Griffin do this whole thing. No, I'm just kidding. This is new. I want to emphasize what we've done here to kind of give you the key features. This is developed by practitioners, people who have actually sat across the table from buyers and sellers and done this literally thousands of times. So this is not somebody who only has 100 transactions contributing to this. We are serious practitioners. What we have done is combine the contract form, the confirmation of agency, the personal interest, the disclaimer, and the wire fraud disclosure into one document, and it's only 9 pages long. It's plain English. There's no legalese in this document. The contingencies are streamlined, they're clear timelines, and they're very simplified conditions. We did not create hoops to jump through for the consumer just because we had a committee that thought that would be a good idea. We have some proprietary clauses that safeguard both parties' interests that are based on the settlement agreement guidelines. So that's the basics of it. You know, when I first got in this industry, and I think you'll agree with me, Scott, well, you too, David, when y'all first got your license, when the purchase and sale agreement was what, three pages? And now it's 12. Why? State law didn't change that much, right? But it still is. So we've modified it. We've stripped away all the extra stuff. So let's dig into it. This is what page 1 looks like. And we're going to look at the top part of that first. Principals, representatives, acknowledgement, and personal interest disclosure. So lines 1 through 18 are your confirmation of agency form. Okay. So if you use this form, you do not have to use a separate confirmation of agency form. Now, many agents in the community will still send you one and say, you got to fill this out. And your response will be, the information is right here. There's no need for me to add additional paperwork because it's all right here. So we're talking about buyer and seller of the parties acknowledge the following. Note that agency status may only be established through separate bilateral written agreement. That's a reminder that filling out a confirmation of agency form does not make you that agent's, that buyer or seller's representative. It is simply a confirmation of a separate bilateral agreement, which is only established through a buyer rep agreement or a listing agreement. That is a bilateral written agreement. That's why you have to have one of those two before you can actually list a property or represent a buyer, because up to that point, you are not. Your natural state in the state of Tennessee is as a facilitator until you establish a bilateral written agreement. You have the buyer name, you have the buyer representative firm name, buyer representative license number. This is you, the agent, okay? Your license name, your number, your contact info goes here. Buyer representative licensee is acting in one of the following: designated agent for the buyer, a facilitator, or buyer's unrepresented. And we put an other line in here. And as you know, we do not do dual agency here at Benchmark. That's been a policy for the last 22 years that we have not allowed dual agency in Tennessee, in Benchmark. It is still legal in the state of Tennessee, inexplicably, I might add, but they still do it. You put other and dual agent, we're going to call you on the carpet. I guarantee you. That's David is smiling right now because he would love to get a piece of that. So this is your confirmation of agency for the buyer. This is your confirmation of agency for the seller. And what do we see down here on line 19 through 21? We see a personal interest statement. So right here, we've eliminated the confirmation of agency and the personal interest if needed. If it's no personal interest, don't fill it out. Boxes not checked are not part of the agreement. That's how the rule reads. Okay, then we move on to property address and or description. Fill in the blanks. Works pretty much like what you're familiar with. Bottom half of that page, the purchase price. Griffin, you want to talk to this because you had a post the other day on our closed group that may have confused some folks. And notice the way we've done this. We have a dollar amount to be written in there. We do not have an extra space for you to write it out in words. Tell us why, Griffin.
Because there are too many times when the written word conflicts with what is spelled out. And so that creates an ambiguity. And then that also creates problems when one party believes it's X, when the other party believes it's Y. There's no legal advantage to including both. This is an old vestige from when there were no typewriters. So contracts were handwritten. And then at that point in time, then what was spelled out is what governed. That carried over into banking law. So if you write a check, whatever you write out is going to govern over what the numbers are in the box to the right. Now that we have typewriters, there's no more concern about fraud. There's no more concern about the illegibility of the writing. Now we have no longer a need to do both. So just do one, what's easiest to read, the numbers over the letters.
There you go. You have it. I hope everybody's clear on that. We had a conversation on the closed group about that the other day, and it still seemed to confuse some folks. So we've eliminated the line where you want to write out stuff because it was being done so horrifically. How's that for an answer, right? So what's included? This is frequently called the screwed in glue clause, and I'm going to read it to you because you also need to read it, but we'll read it together here, okay? As part of the property, all attached light fixtures and bulbs, including ceiling fans, permanently attached plate glass mirrors, heating, cooling, plumbing fixtures and equipment, all doors, storm doors and windows, all window treatments, meaning shutters, blinds, shades, curtains, draperies, and their hardware, all wall-to-wall carpeting, range, all built-in kitchen appliances, all bathroom fixtures and bathroom mirrors, all gas logs, fireplace doors and attached screens, all security system components and controls, garage door openers, and at least blank number of remote controls. This is a slot that invariably gets missed by everybody. Swimming pool and its equipment, awnings, permanently installed outdoor cooking grills, all landscaping, all outdoor lighting, mailboxes, attached basketball goals and backboards. Operative word there, attached basketball goals and backboards. TV and projection system mounting brackets, and this is a change here, so y'all pay attention to this, inclusive of all wall mounts and brackets, but excluding TVs and projectors. Okay, antennae and satellite dishes, excluding components, central vac system and attachments, all available keys, key fobs, access codes, master codes, and other methods necessary for access to the property, including mailboxes and or amenities. That's a lot of words there, but you need to understand what all of them mean. Other items that shall remain goes on line 44, 43, and 44. Items that shall not remain, 45 and 46. Leased items. Leased items that remain with the property, such as security systems, water softener systems, fuel tanks, etc. Select one. The first one is buyer shall assume any and all lease payments. The second one is buyer will not assume any existing lease payments as of closing. Okay? So that's your two options. They're going to assume one or not assume one. Now we get to earnest money. And this is one that we've kind of gone back and forth on, because I initially wanted to have it printed in there that the seller's title company held the money, because as you know, benchmark policy, we do not want to hold earnest money. We just don't. But it says a specific date on or prior to whatever the date is. Originally, we had that as we wanted to give it 5 days automatically, but we realized there are extenuating circumstances, so we left a blank in there. Buyer shall deposit earnest money in the amount of blank with seller's closing agency. Okay. You can modify anything in this document in special stipulations, additional terms. Just want to be clear before anybody starts going off on any of the terms that we put in here. Anything in the document, as always have at every contract, you can modify it with special stipulations. So if you want to do something else, honey, do something else. It's fine. But make sure you do it correctly and document it all. If buyer fails to provide notice and proof within 3 days thereafter, buyer shall be in default. This is an automatic trigger. Buyer shall be in default, and seller shall have the right to terminate this agreement and be entitled to all earnest money. Buyer shall be deemed to have cured the default if buyer deposits earnest money prior to seller's delivery of a notice of termination of this agreement. The earnest money shall be held in escrow and applied toward the purchase price at closing. If closing does not occur as a result of buyer's default in this agreement, all earnest money shall be forfeited to the seller. If closing does not occur as a result of seller's default in this agreement, all earnest money shall be refunded to buyer. So it's an automatic trigger there of what happens if one part or the other defaults. There's no arguing about it. There's no going back and forth about it. There's no confusion. And this is what we've seen in the past, is that there were multiple places that were contradictory to each other and they had to be clarified. Many times that led to attorneys getting involved to have an interpretation. The acceptance of earnest money upon default shall not waive or release any claim for additional damages as a result of the default. So that gives the buyer the additional right to pursue unless they've waived that right. Now, again, we have an earnest money disbursement release form also that will counter that, clarify that, and any of it can be changed in special stipulations of either document. If the parties are unable to resolve a dispute concerning the earnest money or otherwise if directed by one party in writing, closing agency holding the earnest money shall have the right to file an interpleader action and recover expenses and reasonable attorney fees incurred. Pretty straightforward stuff. Plain English. This is what happens if you don't do what you're supposed to do. It's right there in front. Closing, expiration, and possession. We have a date there. That's the closing date. Closing takes place upon the occurrence of both the following events. This is another change. All signed documents reasonably required in connection with the transaction have been delivered to each of the parties of the closing agency, and it's an important and. It's not an or, it's an and. All amounts required from buyer and or seller as set forth in the Alta settlement statement or equivalent closing statement have been delivered to any closing agency designated by either party. Possession to include the delivery of all keys of the entire property and include items above shall be given solely to buyer at the time of closing unless a different time of possession is agreed to in this agreement or in a separate agreement. Okay. Leaving the keys on the kitchen counter doesn't count. They have to be delivered to the buyer. Okay. You have to make arrangements for that, and you have to fulfill those responsibilities to make sure you actually have a closing. This has been problematic over the years. You want to speak to that, anybody? Nobody's raising their hand, so we'll move on.
It's,
Go ahead.
there's no better way to explain it than the way you did. So keep moving.
Philip, I'll jump in just to add a reason for one of those changes. It is important that if there is a closing at, say, 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, that there are times when the title company representing for example, the seller will have received all of the funds that are required by the buyer to be delivered prior to 5 o'clock. However, because it could be a busy day for the seller's closing title company, it could be past a wire cutoff deadline. Then there are times when the seller didn't receive those proceeds. And so there have been 3 fights this year about a seller saying, I didn't receive my proceeds, when in fact the seller's proceeds were resting comfortably in the escrow account of the seller's title company. So this document here clarifies that if the delivery is made to the title company, then the buyer is not in default, notwithstanding whether or not the seller's title company actually delivered those funds to the seller.
So we basically kill an argument here. That is an ongoing argument that we've heard over and over again of when I didn't get my money, so I'm not officially closed. Well, if it's been delivered, then yeah. So there we are. And I hope that makes sense. All right, moving on to the bottom half of that page, prorations, taxes, and assessments. This works in a very familiar way here. You're going to prorate everything. Financing contingency and lender required repairs. And a note in italics afterwards, it says select either option A or B below. The sections not checked are not part of this agreement. Financing contingency waiving. Buyer's obligation to close shall not be subject to any financial contingency. Buyer shall furnish valid proof of available funds to close in a reasonably accepted form within 3 days of the binding agreement date. That's distinctly different than how it's normally transacted now. Buyer shall have the right to confirm the authenticity of the proof of available funds by demanding seller to provide the name and telephone number of the financial institution that issued the proof of available funds. Seller shall have the right to terminate this agreement and be entitled to earnest money if buyer fails to furnish valid proof of available funds within 3 days after seller makes a written demand for such proof. So let's talk about that for a second. As an agent that has a fiduciary responsibility to a client, this line right here assigns you another area of responsibility. The buyer shall have the right to confirm the authenticity of the proof of available funds by demanding seller to provide the name and telephone number of the financial institution that issued the proof of funds. What we didn't say is that that buyer must call, or that agent must call, but an expectation here is created that as a representative of a buyer, you will verify those funds other than just looking at a piece of paper. Hopefully that makes sense. We've had many that were, I won't say fraudulent, but were on the edge, and had somebody picked up the phone and actually called somebody, then it would have been avoided a lot of crisis there. What we've tried to do is create a vehicle here to give you a conduit to have access to that as your buyer's representative to protect your buyer. That's the key point. Down here on 97, financial contingency, loans to be obtained, stating up to X% of the purchase price, buyer must deliver seller no later than 5 p.m., 14 days after the binding agreement date, a lender's conditional commitment letter proving that buyer has submitted a completed loan application and authorized all lender requested actions to obtain the necessary approval. So you're going to have to stay on your lender because you have a fixed time clock here and has been conditionally approved for financing subject to lender's customary underwriting guidelines and final review. Customary underwriting guidelines and review. If buyer fails to deliver the conditional commitment as required, seller shall have the right to demand delivery thereof. If buyer fails to deliver the same within 2 days after delivery of seller's demand, buyer shall be in default and seller may terminate this agreement and shall be entitled to the earnest money. Pretty stiff penalty there for not following up and letting the lender be lax. And that is 100% intentional. Prior to closing, buyer shall promptly respond to the lender's request for documents and information, and further, buyer shall not take any action or incur any intentional additional indebtedness that is reasonably likely to negatively, and it goes on to say, affect the approval process. All right, so let's go back to that for just a second. You have a fixed timeline here, 14 days. They don't deliver it in 14 days. You got to demand it. They don't demand it, the seller can terminate. There's no further conversation. That's the end of the conversation. And it's the end of this deal. So as a buyer's representative, again, you have another responsibility here to serve your client and make sure they shepherd these things along. The days of saying, well, that's on the lender, or that's the lender's problem, or that's the buyer didn't get the lender in order. That's horse manure, and you're going to have to step in and help them. You are the professional. You are the one to guide the process here. We're driving toward a whole new era of eliminating the order takers and elevating the professionals. And that's what clauses like this do. So you have a responsibility to make sure that these things move along in a timely fashion, and that is up to you and your buyer. It also puts the onus on the buyer. This part down here about buyer shall take no action or incur any additional indebtedness. You ever seen one show up for a final inspection in a new car? All right, this clause right here prevents them from doing that in theory. But again, you have an obligation as an agent to explain that to them so that they know and don't do that. I don't think that people do that sort of thing intentionally or fraudulently, but I think they forget. They get excited and caught up in the moment, and they want to go buy a new car and whatever. That kills their ability to obtain a loan, and they have an obligation right here on 107 to not do that. Make sure you point that out to them. VA FHA loan addendum must be attached if buyer seeks VA FHA loan. If buyer fails to attach an VA FHA addendum, buyer waives all right to demand seller to execute any documents required by VA FHA amendment approval. Sorry. If, after the closing date, buyer is unable to obtain financing, financial approval, and our buyer's lender does not fund the transaction despite buyer's good faith efforts, buyer shall deliver to seller the lender's notice denying financial approval. I read that wrong. If before closing date, not after closing date. I'm confusing myself here. So they got to have a denial letter, and such notice will be delivered to seller within 1 day after receipt by buyer. You can't keep it and sit on it. You get it, you got to turn it in. Most of you get turned in that day anyway. And the seller shall have the right to demand that buyer provide the lender's contact information and necessary consents to permit seller to verify the authenticity of the loan denial. In the event this financing contingency is not satisfied, buyer shall have the right to terminate this agreement based on the inability to satisfy the financing contingency prior to closing and receive all earnest money. Pretty straightforward stuff. Appraisal. Check one. The sections not checked are not part of this agreement, okay? Agreement is not contingent upon appraisal value either equaling or exceeding the purchase price, so they're waiving the appraisal. Or it is a contingent. And I apologize for my throat here. It's trying to go out on me. Y'all may have to pick it up and take it forward here in just a second, y'all. But if it's contingent, it's determined by an appraiser license in Tennessee. If the appraised value is equal to or exceeds the purchase price, this contingency is satisfied. If the appraised value does not equal or exceed the purchase price, within 3 days after receiving such notice, buyer shall notify seller via the notification form or equivalent written notice and indicate that buyer is either waiving the appraisal or terminating the agreement. And line 133 down here says, if buyer fails to either waive the appraisal contingency or terminate the agreement as set forth above, this contingency shall be deemed satisfied. Seller shall have the right to request any supporting documentation showing the appraised value did not equal or exceed the purchase price. Plain English, straightforward stuff. All right, moving on to inspections. Select option A or B. The sections not checked are not part of this agreement. Agreement is not contingent, and that's number A is letter A, not contingent upon inspection of the property. Buyer acknowledges the buyer has no right to terminate agreement based on the physical condition of the property. There we go. This agreement is contingent on buyer's satisfaction with all property inspections and investigations and any lease or other contract documents which buyer is entitled to inspect. Buyer may conduct an inspection or use any licensed inspector of buyer's choice at buyer's expense. All inspections and investigations must be completed with a response to seller no later than the inspection deadline, which is defined below. The period between the binding agreement date and the inspection deadline to complete all inspections and investigations is hereinafter known as the inspection period. During the inspection period, seller must permit buyer and buyer's representatives and inspectors reasonable access for inspections with all utilities in service at seller's expense. Buyer assumes all liability for all damage or loss to the property caused by buyer or buyer's representatives during inspections or investigations. Then you have an inspection deadline in there, specific date and time. Do we have a buyer diligence during inspection period? Warning, for lack of better description. And it says, if this agreement is contingent on an inspection, buyer at buyer's expense is strongly advised to A, have a professional property inspection, have a wood destroying inspection, perform any additional inspections, investigations relevant to buyer, and it goes on and lists them out here. This puts the whole onus for inspections or determinations of what's acceptable to the buyer back on the buyer. It is the buyer's responsibility to figure this stuff out, and as an agent, it is your responsibility to help them. Here's a buyer notice to seller during an inspection period. If buyer is satisfied with all inspections investigation, buyer may deliver to seller a release of inspection contingency via the notification form or written equivalent. By signing the agreement, buyer accepts and waives all matters of cosmetic or aesthetic nature in any area that was reasonably accessible to buyer prior to execution of this agreement. An area is considered reasonably accessible if it is in plain view without moving any personal items or fixtures. If buyer is not satisfied with the results of any inspection or investigation, other than matters of cosmetic or aesthetic nature, then buyer prior to inspection shall A, provide seller with a list of written specific objections and immediately terminate this agreement with earnest money returned, or accept the property in its as-is condition. No warranties expressed or implied. Seller has no obligation to make repairs. Or C, provide seller a written list of items which buyer requires to be repaired, replaced, or otherwise addressed prior to closing. Seller shall have the right to request any supporting documentation that substantiates any item listed. The seller must accept it. Buyer's failure to provide each such notice to seller prior to inspection deadline of either repair, replacement, amendment, or written equivalent shall be deemed acceptance of the property in its as-is condition and shall constitute a waiver and release of the inspection contingency. Then we have the resolution period. Buyer's timely delivery of the repair, replacement, amendment, or equivalent written notice ends the inspection period and begins the resolution period of X days. During the resolution period, seller and buyer shall negotiate in good faith to reach a mutual agreement as to the items to be repaired, replaced, addressed. The terms of any agreement shall be evidenced by the execution of a final repair, replacement, amendment, or equivalent written notice. The agreement shall terminate, and the buyer shall be entitled to a refund of the earnest money unless one of the following occurs. I want you to pay attention to this, because this is going to actually, if you don't reach agreement, the deal is dead unless you do one of these two things. Seller and buyer reach a mutually agreeable written resolution during the resolution period, which may include buyer providing notice to seller that buyer is accepting the property as is during the resolution period, and seller shall have the obligation to accept the same, but shall have no obligation to make repairs. Or B, the parties execute a mutually agreeable written extension of the resolution period. Okay, that's the end of the resolution period there. So that's probably going to require some conversation. Scott, Griffin, David, y'all want to speak to that any?
I would like to, if you wouldn't mind. Can you go back to line 164, prior slide? I want to give some context to that first line there. Buyer accepts and waives all matters of a cosmetic or aesthetic nature in any area that was reasonably accessible to buyer prior to execution of this agreement. This adds a little bit of buyer benefit here because we all have accepted the fact that if a matter is a cosmetic or aesthetic nature, then it's not subject to the inspection, therefore can't terminate a contract based on something that was cosmetic. Why? Because the buyers can see that before they submit an offer and can't go back to the old days when they would just try to go under contract in a competitive bidding situation, knowing full well they were going to try to renegotiate the deal by holding up the continuation of the process because of an inspection that was related to cosmetic issues. So this sentence right here is designed to say, if there is a rug covering up a big burn mark or a hole in the floor, or if there is a piano that is in front of a wall that contains a hole, you name it, whenever you're trying to make the house look gorgeous and you have your nice listing photos and people walk through, let's all accept the fact that a seller is one who can decide which areas might not be the most aesthetically pleasing and cover those up. Well, previously and historically, that doesn't leave a buyer a whole lot of options if they go to do the final walkthrough and see that the property is cosmetically in a much different state than it was prior to going under contract. So although a buyer will waive things that are in plain view, i.e. readily accessible, this contract now does not deem a buyer to have waived things that are effectively concealed by a seller through creative staging.
Very good. I'm just typing an answer here. There was a question that came up about, and actually I will answer it live now that I've got the mic back. Question that came up here about the listing agreement and the buyer rep agreement. They are on transaction desk. They are on dot loop. They are on the dash now, and they will be on all those because they are required forms. The other forms are not required unless you're a non-realtor. And right now, I think we are not going to have them on transaction desk simply because it costs us $50 per page to put them on transaction desk. So, all right. Thank you, Griffin. Moving on to the bottom of that page there, bottom of page 4, is your disclaimer notice. It reads pretty much like the other one that you're accustomed to using, but it's greatly simplified. We love to have disclaimers. We love to say we're not responsible for anything in this business, but we also know, I have found in the court cases I have been in, that they really don't make a flip. Every one we've been in, the disclaimer was like, yeah, whatever, you got that. It doesn't really matter to us, was usually what came out in court. So what we tried to do is put a basic one in there so that everyone understands. And we even got it in boldface right here. Buyer and seller acknowledge brokers are not experts with respect to the above matters, and that they have not relied on any advice, and so on and so forth. So we've tried to keep it as relevant as we could, even though in some courts it might be considered irrelevant. But again, this eliminates another form. So we've eliminated how many forms now? This is number 4, right? Okay. Number 4. All right. Moving on to final inspection. Obviously, you're going to retain the right to have a final inspection to make sure the repairs are completed and walk through the house. In line 224 says, closing shall constitute buyer's acceptance of the condition of the property on the closing date, provided, however, that closing shall not constitute a waiver or release of any claim arising in tort to expressly include any claim of fraud, misrepresentation, concealment, or omission. And we hear this a lot. Well, you closed on the house, therefore you've accepted the condition of the house, therefore you don't have a claim. This follows really what actually happens in law. If it's every time that they're, oh, well, you didn't disclose the condition properly, you didn't disclose that water intrusion, you didn't disclose whatever, the word fraud is always in that complaint. So that gets you around. So it was there already, even though there were great protections in there of saying, well, you took it, it's yours. We don't have any lot, we're done. That doesn't work. Never did work. We're just clarifying that it doesn't work. Section 10, lead-based paint disclosure. Select one. It does apply or it doesn't apply. That's your 2 options. Talk about lead-based paint for just a second, lead-based paint disclosure. The EPA, the U.S. government EPA, has a form that's called lead-based paint disclosure. That is the form that we are going to go back to in our non-realtor forms library. It's very similar to the one you're accustomed to seeing, but it has less extraneous language on it. Same thing with the property condition disclosure. Property condition disclosure is actually codified in Tennessee state law, and it's promulgated by the legislature what the Tennessee property condition disclosure says. So we're going to go back to that form in our non-realtor forms. And again, if you are a realtor, you may use either one. If you are a non-realtor, you will not have access to TAR forms, so you must use ours. It's that simple. Don't complicate it any further than that. Title and conveyance. This one is not sticky, but we tried to clarify a lot of it because it had gotten really complex. And it says, seller shall convey to buyer good and marketable title. That a title insurance company licensed to do business in Tennessee shall insure at its regular rates, subject only to standard exceptions. Tell us what that means, Griffin.
It's a change. So previously, if you look at the contracts that we all know and love, the definition of what's good and marketable title is defined to be that title which a licensed Tennessee title company would insure. And that's not what the definition of good marketable title is. Tennessee, for a long, long time, decades and decades, has defined what good marketable title means. And so the contract definition didn't use that definition. I'm sorry, the contract didn't use that definition. Instead, the contract defined good marketable as that which a title company would insure. That is not satisfying to a lot of buyers. Some buyers don't want insurable title. Some buyers want good and marketable title. And so this contract now has been modified slightly so that now there does have to be good and marketable title, and it has to be one that a licensed title company would insure. There were too many times when these deals were, unfortunately, they were falling, title was being passed, and there were marketability issues, but the title company or the underwriter had decided, well, it's an insurable risk. We'll go ahead and we'll roll the dice with it. Well, the definition shouldn't be based on the risk assessment determined by the underwriter. The risk assessment should be based on, or the definition should be based on the risk assessments from the buyer. So if a buyer wants good and marketable title, this contract allows them to terminate the contract if they can't receive it. Whereas previously, you can't terminate the contract unless the insurance company is the one that said that it's not insurable. So slight distinction, but it is a distinction with a difference here. The remainder of this section 11 here, the Romanettes 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are standard. That's common, so no issues with any of those. That is just basically stating that the buyer is going to receive title and it's going to be subject to matters that are already a matter of public record. All those matters there are matters of public record. So effectively, it's shifting the burden onto the buyer to make sure that they're aware of the public records that relate to the property itself. And then this also, if, for example, there is something that is off the public records, then the buyer can terminate the contract, but only if it constitutes a material defect that renders the title not good and not marketable.
Operative word here is shall insure at its regular rates. And before, I think what we were accustomed to seeing is if it was just insurable at all. So that's a key difference. Title examination gives you the options of what to do if you're not satisfied with it. You can accept it, or you can require the seller to remedy the defects. Pretty straightforward stuff. Then we move down to the bottom of that page, and I drew this blue line in here because what I was showing you before covered down to about right here. So we're picking up right here with buyer represents buyers not prohibited by law from owning property. Deed's going to be made out in what name? Then you got to notify the closing agency at least 7 days ahead of time. That's a change, I believe, because a lot of times that didn't come up until the end. And then we talk about association payoffs at least 7 days before closing. Whatever.
And Phil, I'll jump in here just on that deed. We've seen too many, and if I may just give a brief historical context. This started
Please.
6 months ago. So 6 months ago, when Phillip said, previously he had mentioned, I'm pro agent, I'm pro transparency, and I'm pro consumer. So the objective for all these forms where the committee reviewed it was to make the contract clear and unambiguous so that the reasonable expectations of the parties were contemplated within this contract. So going forward, when we had our sample size of the committee and the experiences that we've had, we can contribute those when we decide what is appropriate to include in a contract and what's not. But we collectively went a step further, and over the last 6 months, so since March, we have written down every single broker question about the interpretation or application of the contract, every agent question about the interpretation and application of the contract, and also from buyers and sellers. Where did they have questions about what something meant? Where did they have a problem where there was some ambiguity? We took those and then we put them into a large spreadsheet. So that's 6 months worth of transactions. We're closing between 200 and 250 per month. So we have over 1,200 different contracts that have been submitted that the agents have been involved in. So there's the large sample size. And once we started seeing a commonality between what the complaints or issues were, concerns, questions, Well, that large sample size means that we have to address it somehow. So one of those was this deed language where people were wanting to change the name on the deed. And that's completely fine, completely reasonable because they want anonymity. Or if they just want to put it into a trust because their financial advisor had advised them to do it. Or if they want to put it into an LLC because it's an investment property and they want to have some protection from the personal liability. Well, those things were coming up prior to closing, and some sellers were not amenable to amending, or the amendment didn't come through. So this now just states that, look, buyer, you can actually hold title however you want it. That does not relieve you of any obligations under the contract. It just allows you to have the vesting as you want it to be, as long as you just provide the title company notice within the time frame prior to closing. So this is one that has come up too often, where you had a buyer who unfortunately wasn't able to take possession in their own name, and then after closing had to then quit claim it. And since there's a record of that, well, the public records really didn't give too much anonymity there because the conveyance was via quit claim deed. Everybody would know that that actual first buyer was the true party in possession. And this was kind of a safety issue for several people. So we just wanted to make sure that buyers who needed that safety and protection or anonymity, they were able to have that, not only for that, but also for just the way that they have set up their financial planning.
100%. And to deliver that 7 days prior to closing and not the day before. That's another big deal. And to clarify what Griffin was talking about, the sample size, we actually been working on these documents for nearly a year now. It really started really hard. What was it, Scott, back in February? And we tried to engage other attorneys and they wanted a lot of money. And so we said, we've done this before, we can figure this out. The sample size that he's talking about there is Momentum's sample size. Benchmark sample size is nearly 1,000 transactions every month. And David Lee has access to all those. And so this combination of recurring issues within the contracts that we were seeing was a combination of both Momentum's input and Benchmark's input, as well as the principal brokers who see where the problems are. So what we try to do is homogenize all that into a single document. And just like the buyer rep agreement and just like the listing agreement that we released back in June, I'm sure we will at some point in time in the future next year see some revisions to this document, as we have in application found places that needed to be sanded down. These are all living documents. These are all, we're not going to just only look at this once a year. We're not going to change it every month. But we're going to listen to what the market tells us and do things the right way, because we are, as you said, Griffin, focused on the consumer and the agent. Hopefully that makes sense. You were going to say something there, Scott?
No, go ahead.
Moving on to section 12, closing expenses, seller expenses. Seller shall pay all existing loans or liens affecting the property, including penalties, release. Goes on to list them there. Whatever it takes to get the estoppel letters, statement of accounts from all the associations, property management companies, mortgage holders. That's the seller's responsibility. Seller closing fee, doc prep or attorney's fees, fee for preparation of deed, notary fee, financial institution wire transfer fee, or commercial courier service fee relating to the disbursement of any lien payoff. We've tried to be as articulate as possible and specific as possible in what was the seller's responsibility. Goes on, talks about FERPTA, failure to do so, so on and so forth. And then the buyer's expenses. Buyer shall pay all transfer fees and recording fees on deed of conveyance. Again, very specific. Read it. It is different than what you're accustomed to because it has much greater specificity in it. And then title expenses. Cost of title searches, loan policy, and standard owner's policy. Rates to be as filed with the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance shall be paid as follows. Check a box. And instead of paid by buyer, paid by seller, and a blank, we're going to have you name a percentage paid by the buyer and a percentage named by the seller. And then, of course, the caveat of simultaneous issue rates shall apply. If you want to modify it, we're giving you space to modify it here in 298, 299. But we tried to guide you as close as possible on the clarity of how title insurance works and the title expenses work. Specify the closing agency for the buyer and the contact info. Specify agency for seller and contact info. If you're a benchmarkian, you send it through the compliance process. They are going to require you to put the contact info in there. You can't just name a company. You have to put the contact info in there. Home protection plan. You want to get a warranty, don't get a warranty. Check the box there. Items not selected or not part of the agreement. So if you don't want one, leave it blank. And then other provisions. Binding effect, entire agreement, modification, assignment, and binding agreement date. This agreement shall be for the benefit of and be binding upon the parties hereto, their heirs, successors, legal representatives, and assigns. This agreement constitutes the sole and entire agreement between the parties hereto, and no modification of this agreement shall be binding unless signed by all parties or assigns to this agreement. No representation, promise, or inducement not included in this agreement shall be binding upon any party hereto. It's hereby agreed by both buyer and seller that any real estate agent working with or representing either party, shall not have the authority to bind the buyer, seller, or any assignee to any contractual agreement. You, the agent, cannot sign without power of attorney for a buyer or seller. Any assignment shall fulfill all terms and conditions. Any assignee shall, I'm down here on line 320, shall fulfill all the terms and conditions of this agreement and otherwise comply with applicable law. The parties hereby authorize either licensee to insert the time and date of receipt of the notice of acceptance of the final offer. The binding agreement date shall be the date and time that final acceptance and execution of this agreement is received by the party entitled to notice thereof. That's different. Griffin and I went back and forth on this quite a bit. Let's talk about that. You're not going to talk about it, are
You want me to jump in here? Okay.
well,
Like, this is the sentence I've been dreading since 8:58. So let's just jump into it.
yeah.
So I will say that I'll put it in the category of what exists in contract law. In contract law, you can sign a contract, and if you don't deliver it, there is no contract. And so you only have a few things that are essential for a contract. You have to have mutual assent, you have to have consideration, then you have to have delivery of that contract. And so I believe that it is possible for someone to have received a document and then they can, based on the definition in the contract that a lot of people have used for a long time, then they can wait to deliver that contract and it delays the binding agreement date. And so what we're trying to do here, and of course, if you have a delayed delivery of the binding agreement date, well, now you're behind the clock a little bit on your inspections, you're behind the clock a little bit on some other deadlines that may be inserted into the contract. So really we tried to simplify it. The goal here was to state that it is not binding until one, there shall be the time that final acceptance of the document has been received by the party entitled to notice thereof. So we want to be able to make sure we deliver it. If the contact information for the parties is included in the contract, then the delivery constitutes the method that has been designated. And so once it's received, then it's the binding agreement date. And it's as simple as that, is that it is now the last party to have accepted the contract and delivered it such that that notice is received by the counterparty. That's when the clock starts.
It's an important difference, and it's more attuned to what real contract law is. But we went back and forth on that, trying to figure out the nuances of it. We can explain these in the classes that David's going to be talking through the documents. So be sure and attend those. As we said, we're going to have at least one class in each office between now and the end of the year. So these are the times to ask those specific questions. Make sure you have them clear and fixed in your head before you go talk to a client about it. Survival clause, pretty standard stuff. Governing law and venue, again, it's standard contract stuff. Time is of the essence. terminology. The one I want to point out here, masculine, they're basically singular shall mean the plural and vice versa and so on and so forth. But number 4, the term days used throughout this agreement shall be deemed to be calendar days ending at 11:59 p.m. If you want something different, you need to modify and clarify that. In the event of a performance deadline, however, other than the completion of repair deadline and offer expiration date, if it occurs on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the performance deadline shall extend to the next following business day. That's pretty customary and what you're accustomed to seeing. And it goes on to define what holidays are. In calculating any time period in this agreement, the day of the event creating the time period is excluded, and the time period shall commence the first day thereafter. So if you say, everybody signs it today, this is my binding agreement date, well, actually, day 1 is tomorrow. That's what that means. Good faith cooperation, notices, fax, email, by the way, AuthentiSign, DocuSign, Dotloop, they're now legal signatures in all 50 states. So anybody says, I got to have a wet signature, they're really kind of fudging on you. You can push back, whatever. Risk of loss. The risk of hazard or casualty loss or damage to the property shall be borne by seller until transfer of title. And then it defines what happens if it's more than 10% damage. You got 3 options there. Equal housing, severability, contract construction. These are all standard clauses, but you need to read them and understand them. And defaults and remedies. This is section L. It's JKL, yeah. In the event of default by either party under this agreement, including but not limited to failure to perform obligations, breach of representations or warranties, or non-compliance with statutory or regulatory requirements, the non-defaulting party shall be entitled to the following remedies, which may be pursued individually or in combination without any waiver with respect to the party's election of remedies subject to Tennessee law. This is standard contract law, okay? Specific performance, termination and damages, equitable relief. And, in contracts, you have to figure out, has the party, say, for example, the seller gets in the middle of a transaction and just decides they don't want to sell. Well, has the buyer really been damaged? Possibly, if they have stuff sitting on a moving van, if they have terminated their lease on their current place, if they've already sold their house and they're going to incur additional costs for additional housing, that sort of thing. So there is potential damage. Now, would a judge in this country ever require somebody to sell a house that they didn't want to sell? Probably not. Have you ever seen that, Griffin?
You'll see it. It depends. So yeah, you can see it. It depends on the good faith or bad faith of the seller.
That's
If
right.
there's an exigency, then sometimes not. But specific performance is what's called an extraordinary remedy. So it's an equitable remedy. So if the equities dictate, then a court will order it, and it's usually because the seller has operated in bad faith.
Through an action in a Tennessee court of competent jurisdiction. Attorney fees and costs. Each party pays their own. There are other remedies. Again, recordation of agreement prohibited. You can't record a contract, y'all. You can record a deed, but you can't record a contract. We wanted to put that in there to make sure. Mitigation, the non-defaulting party shall take reasonable steps to mitigate damages, but this obligation does not require the non-defaulting party to accept defective performance. So you have a tornado and it blows your roof off, then the responsibility of the seller is to go put a tarp on it, not just leave it there because he's sold the house, okay? Greenbelt clause, again, if it's not involving Greenbelt, don't check it. If it does involve Greenbelt, then you need to go investigate and educate yourself on what that means so that you guide your client properly. And then 1031 exchange, we'll move down here to the bottom. Let me go back to that. If the property is being purchased and sold in connection with a like-kind exchange pursuant to section 1031 of the IRS code, the parties agree to execute all documents reasonably necessary. That means the seller needs to execute the documents if the buyer presents them. That's what that clause does. Special stipulations, you got lots of room to alter it however you want to. And we took the lines, we initially had lines in here, and that became cumbersome with dot loop and other mechanisms if you put it in DocuSign or whatever forms other you want to put in there. So we left lots of room there. And then the last page, if the time limit of the offer at the top, and you have the wire fraud warning with places for the buyer to initial. Because this addresses the buyer. It doesn't necessarily address the seller. It addresses the buyer. And we say again, never trust wire instructions sent via email. And so help me, if we catch a benchmark agent transmitting wiring instructions, they are going to be hung from the lamppost out here. David Lee will personally hang them from the lamppost. It has happened, and it has caused money to be lost, and we don't want to do that. Parties acknowledge that the consideration given, that's just the final clause, and then we conclude here with the buyer making the offer and the seller accepting the offer, and then acknowledgement of receipt. Hereby acknowledges the receipt of the final accepted offer on a date, and this shall be referred to as the binding agreement date for purposes of establishing performance deadlines as set forth in the agreement. We've talked about that pretty extensively, but don't waste time. If you get a contract back, go ahead and get it done. Don't play the games that we see sometimes in the marketplace of holding a contract and not sending it back for 8 hours or so. That's problematic and creates a whole cascade of issues. And then 480, put this in here to clarify again, because many agents have never read section 14 or the detail section of the contracts. So put it in there and see section 14, paragraph E above for definition of the term days as used in this agreement. Be familiar with that, what that means and where it goes. So that is the contract. Purchase and sale agreement, that's page 9. Okay. Let me pause and go back and answer some questions here. And some of these, let's see, Lindsay, I'm going to answer that question live in a minute. All right. I'm just clicking through the questions here. Y'all bear with me for just a second. So Eddie Poole asks a question, does the party receiving the executed contract need to acknowledge they received it? What about lost email, etc.? So I think we talked about that. Maybe we didn't. But anytime you send a legal document to another person, you need to pick up the phone and ensure that they have received it. Whether you do that via text, email, phone call, my advice is phone call. Make sure they receive it. Don't let it lay. Don't just willy-nilly return it and then not respond. If you're sending one, your buyer or your seller was the one who accepted or countered or whatever, pick up the phone and call the other party and say, I just returned that offer to you guys. We're making a counter offer or we're accepting it or whatever, just so you have an acknowledgement verbally from the other party that they received it. So that should eliminate the lost email question. And the way this reads here is acknowledgement of receipt, blank hereby acknowledges receipt of the final accepted offer on a certain date. So that should answer your question, I believe, Eddie. Thank you, Jeff. Bear with me. I'm just reading through the questions here. So there's a question recurring here of what if the other side sends you, what if you're using this contract, this offer, you made an offer, the other side sends you back the separate confirmation of agency, the separate disclaimer, the separate personal interest. Go ahead and sign them. It's fine. It doesn't really matter. It's redundant, but it doesn't really matter. Just make sure that what you're signing agrees with what you offered. Okay, so you have to be really careful with that. Daniel asks, earnest money and inspection period. Can we switch back to, quote, within X number of days after bound contract? It's impossible to have a firm date if counter offers prolong negotiations. You can modify any paragraph in this contract in the special stipulations section. That section right there, special stipulations. You can modify any aspect of it in there that you're comfortable with modifying and your client agrees to. So again, this is we have a buyer. Anna asks, we have the buyer and use this new PSA agreement. I understand COA and wire fraud, et cetera, docs are included, but if we receive an offer with the TAR purchase and sale agreement, but are no longer a realtor, do we use separate forms for those, for each of those other documents like wire fraud? Okay, so we will have what is included in this PSA combined document. We will also have those documents separate, the wire fraud, the disclaimer, the confirmation of agency in our forms library. If you're dealing with an agent who is a realtor and sends those to you, kindly ask them to furnish the document they wish you to sign. And that should be their job anyway. Okay, so thank you, Vicky. Vicky's complimenting us on our thoroughness. Daniel's asking, how are other big brokerages responding to these forms? I will answer that in just a second because we are not done with this presentation yet. And another question along those lines from Jennifer. And I think those are the main hard ones. I will come back to that. I will come back to the questions in just a second, but let's move on now. So here's our point. We are trying to put you as a benchmark affiliate in a competitive advantage to build the trust with your client faster. And I think all clients, this is the number one thing in all the lawsuits that came up, is that the clients didn't understand what was happening. They didn't understand who was getting paid, how they were getting paid, who shot Johnny, all that stuff. So we try to build as much clarity as possible. That should enable you to close deals quicker because it's simpler to explain. It will definitely reduce risk as compliant with the settlement. These forms that we are releasing here are as compliant with the settlement agreements as we can possibly make them. And we put these protective clauses in there that Griffin and the others were discussing to minimize disputes. And a lot of those, when you have an expansive clause in an agreement, in an offer, it causes confusion. And we tried to eliminate all that stuff and make it as simple and as plain English as possible. So I encourage you, number one, when you read these documents, don't infer other stuff into the document. Read what the document says, interpret the document as it speaks. So the document speaks for itself. You don't need to add flourish to it. Just explain it. They will differentiate you for sure. And I honestly believe they will become the standard in Tennessee. And as we have said, new forms are available December 2025, late December. They'll be in dot loop and in benchmark dash. The listing agreement and the buyer rep agreement, which are required forms, will be in transaction desk. The rest of our documents will not. So I hope that makes sense to you. They will be in .loop and in Benchmark Dash. If you do not have a .loop account, you need to send an email to support@benchmarkrealtytn.com, and we can get you set up with a .loop account if you're a Benchmark affiliate. But they'll also be in static PDF on the Dash. You can download them and put them into whatever form you want to use, whatever signing format you want to use. Now let's get to the questions. But wait, what if, you know, shoulda, and you shoulda all over yourself if you're not careful. I said should. I didn't say what you thought I said. But immediately the question comes up, what if an MLS listing says offers on TNR forms only? And I will tell you directly that this verbiage conflicts with TREC Rule 1260-02-.08. It may be a client's instructions, though. So that's the only way that is a bona fide instruction. Our policy is that if you put this in the MLS on a benchmark listing, our compliance department is going to come back and ask you to see where your client gave you those instructions. And it better be in the listing agreement itself, or we're going to kick it back to you. You can't just write it in there, because remember that modifying any agreement over a client's signature is kind of a problem. So don't just write it in there if compliance catches you. Make sure that if your client instructed you that way, then make sure it's in the listing agreement. But TREC Rule 1260-02-08 says a broker or affiliate broker promptly shall tender every written offer to purchase or sale obtained on a property until a contract is signed by all properties. Upon obtaining a proper acceptance of an offer to purchase, any counter offer a broker or affiliate broker promptly shall deliver true executed copies of same, signed by the seller, to both the purchaser and the seller. Brokers and affiliate brokers shall make certain that all of the terms and conditions of the real estate transaction are included in the contract of purchase. In the event, and this is one that we many times don't follow, in the event an offer is rejected, the buyer or affiliate broker shall request the seller to note the rejection on the offer and return the same to the offeror or the offeror's agent. That would be you, the buyer's agent. Meaning, if you send them an offer, they must present it, and if you request it, they must provide proof that the offer has been presented and rejected by the seller. So you can't just willy-nilly go in and we're only going to accept TNR forms. You have the potential of violating TREC Rule 1260-02-08. Go look it up. Part 2 of that question. What if an MLS listing says offers only on TNR forms? This verbiage also conflicts with the Code of Ethics. Standard of Practice 1.6 says realtors shall submit offers and counteroffers objectively and as quick as possible. It doesn't say what form it's on. It could be on a piece of yellow notebook paper. If you send them a bona fide offer under TREC rules and Code of Ethics, they have an obligation to present that offer. Standard of Practice 1.7 says basically the same thing. And again, conclusion, meaning if you send them an offer, they must present it. And if you request it, they must provide proof the offer was presented and rejected. So you have potential to file a TREC complaint. You have potential to file a Code of Ethics complaint. I just want to be clear on that. These are the consequences of rejecting. Number 2, what if using benchmark forms puts my buyer at a disadvantage? Well, my first question for you is, have you ever sold any new construction? Because there is not a builder in the state of Tennessee that will accept any other contract form than their own. Plain and simple. An offer is an offer, and all offers must be presented. It can be written on a napkin, and the listing agent is required by the rules of the Tennessee Real Estate Commission and the Code of Ethics to present it and provide proof that it is in fact being presented if you request it. Key point, if you request it. Failing to present offers received or refusing to accept offers received, regardless of format, is grounds for a formal complaint by the agent, the broker, and the consumer. So I just want to put that out there. Question 3, what do I call myself if I'm not going to be a realtor? Well, what does your license say? It says affiliate broker. You can call yourself a real estate agent. You can call yourself a real estate licensee. You can call yourself a real estate professional. Whatever you want to call yourself, except you cannot call yourself a realtor if you are not a realtor, if you are not a member of the National Association of Realtors, because it's a registered trademark of NAR. Even though I would clearly advocate that the brand has been allowed to become commoditized, just like Band-Aids and Kleenex. You don't ask for a facial tissue, you ask for a Kleenex. And that's exactly what happened. The 99% of the population of the United States, everybody with a license is a realtor. Little r, not big R. And most of them can't even spell it. Most of them spell it realtor. And I thought really seriously about trademarking realtor and letting you guys use that as your brand. But I didn't do it because I figured everybody would say, well, Phillip's being a smart aleck again. Bottom line is we don't care because we're too busy taking care of the consumer, but others will be watching. Let's go back for just a second talking about these concerns of the forms. I have had conversations with multiple brokerages in this area in Tennessee, and all of them have or are reviewing our form. And to date, all of them have said, this is a good form. We will instruct our agents to accept this form. Now, whether or not that actually happens in practice, I don't know. Do I think that other brokerages will come out and have another set of forms on their own? This is an expensive process, y'all. We've dropped about 100 grand on this process. I can promise you that none of the smaller brokerages will engage in that. Some of the large ones may, but my offer here is that we will share. We're here to help the industry. We're not caring about particular pieces of paper. We are caring about the consumer and we are caring about the agent. And if you are a brokerage owner or a principal broker with another firm and you would like to discuss using our forms, fine, reach out to us. Scott Rowland, the man right there in the middle. Scott Rowland. Say hi, Scott.
Look, I think one thing you need to remember here is that it all goes back to the consumer. You have someone that wants to sell a house. You have someone that wants to purchase a house. As long as they're protected and represented well, which is what we do as professionals, keeping that in mind, they don't care what it's written on. So if you have a seller that required their offers come in on a certain form, please let me know. I'd love to be educated about that.
We would love to document that. Yeah. So I think there's your answer to many of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat over here that, what about this? What about this? And again, what I said in the beginning, don't catastrophize this. So what if you don't want to be a realtor anymore? We talked about this. In fact, you've seen this image previously. RealTracs no longer requires you to be an association member to have access to RealTracs MLS. You got an email back in, I don't know, a long time ago. The subject line was realtor requirement for RealTracs access removed. It says as of April the 1st, that requirement, this past April 1st, that requirement was removed. So you can be a non-realtor member of RealTracs. Now our plan is this. This is the process. RealTracs is association owned, so their rule is all or nothing, meaning everybody in an office must belong or no one in the office can belong. So what we had to do was go set up a non-realtor firm at each location. The non-realtor firm is the same broker, same location, same phone number, same signs, same facility access. It's just a different firm, except for the firm. They're the same except for the firm license. And for differentiation, you will see them show up in MLS as location-REA. So Murfreesboro-REA, meaning real estate agent, Midtown REA, et cetera. REA simply stands for real estate agent. So your task list, if you decide to do this, is notify your association you're not going to be renewing. Don't just not pay the bill. Don't just ignore the emails. Just tell them. Just be honest with them. Say, I've looked at options, and I'm not going to do this. You're going to go on core. You're going to transfer to the new benchmark firm. It's $25 to Trek. And then you're going to go delete all references to realtor in all marketing everywhere. And I can tell you right now, there are multiple agents out here using the realtor trademark wrong already. JohnnyRealtor@gmail.com is a violation of the trademark. You need to change your email address. Okay. You cannot use the word realtor anywhere. I can't say that often enough, but I want to be clear. And the reason I want to be clear is because I know that NAR is going to be watching. There's a movement across the country of moving away from the associations and questioning their value proposition, which is fine. But one of the key components that the association feels is their competitive advantage is realtor and forms. So those who stray from the herd are going to be under observation, meaning us, not you, us. You'll be under observation for misusing the trademark. Make sure you don't do that. We've already had one or two affiliates that got thumped because they were using it. None of us understood it was that way they were using it was a violation, but apparently NAR thought it was. So they sent them a nasty gram. Like, you got all this crap going on in the world with these class action lawsuits, and you're worried about somebody misusing the word realtor. Okay. That's where we are. It is what it is. So to be or not to be, you've seen this before. If you choose to drop your association membership for 2026, you cannot use realtor in your advertising. You will lose access to association benefits. Question mark on the code of ethics. Are you bound by them? Technically, no. And then you'll, of course, lose access to TNAR forms. Address each of those. Again, the brand has already been commoditized, but it is a registered trademark, so we have to be careful. Association benefits, I mean, if you find them attractive, go for it, baby. Yeah, it's up to you. Education, the awards, realtor prom, social events, it's up to you. It's fine. We're not going to criticize you. We're not going to complain about it. It's a value. If you find the value high enough, then go for it. Code of ethics, this is clearly an ineffective argument. We can give you examples daily of realtors acting outside of the code of ethics. So I would argue that it really is a hollow argument. And then after, if you decide to not be a realtor, you will lose access to the TNAR forms because they're not available. They're copyrighted forms. You got an email back on July the 11th that had a FAQ. We've also discussed this on our YouTube channels on Fridays with Phillip, so go look them up and go watch them. That FAQ included 4 pages of what ifs, what ifs, what ifs, what ifs. But again, I'm going to repeat the process for becoming a realtor and your task list down at the bottom. Notify the association you're not going to be renewing, transfer into the new benchmark firm, and then delete all references of realtor. I want to stress again, this is the same broker, same location, same phone number, same signs, same facility access. Because a principal broker can be principal broker of 2 firms as long as they are at the same address. So it'll be the same broker. You got them on speed dial now, you'll have them on speed dial then. All right. Panelists, do you have anything to add to what we've been discussing today?
Phillip, I would go ahead and say, if you've got questions that haven't been answered today, show up at one of our 14 classes that we're going to have in November and December, and we'll answer anything we can at that point.
Well, I promise you we'll have answers. Not anything we can. We will have answers. Tisha makes a comment here, says this is an FYI. This is how the forms were 20 years ago before we got to where we are today. And that's the most astute observation I've heard today. That's all we're trying to do is taking it back to where the agent doesn't have a lot of complications in running their business. There are less disputes and the consumer is taken care of. Ellie was asking about what about classes for our hours? These are non-CE classes. These are for the forms. If you want to know about the forms, you can come learn about the forms. We're not going to get them qualified with the real estate commission and try to get CE credit.
Philip, I'll jump in with one thing too, is that something that you and I have talked about many times, and that is that consistent with your pro-consumer, pro-transparency, and also pro-agent, the goal of these documents is to make them clear, make them so that they can be read by anyone and it's plain language. And the reason for that is because then that prevents disputes between buyers and sellers. And that also prevents the agent from being exposed to liability. So the goal here is protection for those agents because we're pro-agent. And then ultimately, it's also the protection of the brokerages because we all know that if there's ever a lawsuit, that's just not the buyer and seller. It's always the agent. It's always the brokerage because they have the deepest pockets. For those other brokerages who may look at the benchmark form, I hope that's a collaborative effort to try to minimize the exposure points and then to make the document increasingly clear by simplifying it. Documents mutate over time and they grow from being 3 pages to 15 pages. We've all seen it. We all have our templates. But sometimes it's important to not just keep rehabbing a house, like picturing the East Nashville houses where you keep adding them on until eventually the house is just not even close to its original form. And I'm not saying we're there right now, but I'm saying it's time for us to simplify the process, get back to where we used to be, and make sure that the protections are there for all the parties, consumer, agent, and brokerage.
Amen. From your lips to God's ears. And that's the whole point. It's not any special contrived animosity toward any organization at all. We are focused on the agent. We are focused on the consumer, and that is period. That is the end of it. There's some questions in here that really just address them with your broker. They're really straightforward. One question, what do my business cards look like? Well, why would you change your business cards? Unless you have the word realtor on your business card, it doesn't need to change. That's the only thing that would have to change. Name is the same. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to go back to here again. Okay. Same broker, same name, same location, same phone number, same signs, same facility access. We will in the paperwork notate it as location -REA. So non-realtors would select that box on the checklist. Realtors would select the other box. Doesn't really matter. I mean, this is talking about public facing stuff here. Same broker, same location, same phone number, same signage, same facility access, same business cards. Unless you've used the word realtor on there, you can't use the word realtor if you're a non-association member. Now, there's a question about the working group led by Dan Duffy presenting concerns to NAR. I am part of that working group, so my only advice or comment on that is to stay tuned. More to come. Again, if you've read those articles, you know what we're talking about, and you know that we are not trying to tear down. We are trying to make it better so that it is survivable, so that it's focused on the consumer and the agent and not how it has become deviated from that. Period. That's it. That's the motivation. I will tell you this, November the 16th, their IRS Form 990 from 2024, yes, last year, is finally being released. And we'll be publishing articles on that, pointing out the discrepancies in how the money is spent and where the flow of funds go. You'll want to pay attention to that because it will be a real eye-opener for all of the associations, not just NAR. But I think that's the essence of it. And I think that we are in good shape here. We've got lots of other simpler questions that probably would be easier addressed to your brokerage, to your broker, principal broker, or as David said, come to the class, right? All right. I guess that's about it for us, guys. I appreciate it. If there's anything that we can help you with, we will continue in this effort to make our industry better. And we are really glad that you're here to join us. And Phillip Cantrell signing off. David, Griffin, Scott, any last words? No? Everybody's shaking their head no. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. Have a great weekend.